Hello and welcome this evening to our latest Glasgow Loves EU lockdown live stream. And this evening we're really pleased to have with us Dr. John Bates of the University of Glasgow, a lecturer in Polish in the School of Languages, and with wide-ranging interests in history and culture and the arts of Poland. So we'll have lots to talk about. If you would like to send in any questions, please send them in on social media. And this evening we've got Paul from our group who'll be monitoring social media questions. And we've also got Bernd with us who's doing the technical sides of the interview. So I think we thought of doing this interview first when we were preparing our Glasgow Eurowalk, and we were going around looking at historical links in Glasgow, and we came across the Sikorski Polish Club and the St Simon's Church, and really interesting history outside both of those buildings. And we were really lucky to be put in touch with Dr. John Bates. So welcome this evening. And so just to kick off this evening, how did you get into studying Poland and Polish? Was it a family connection you had?
I suppose in common with certain others, it was Russia to start with. And since I'm so old that I lived through the rather exciting period of the space race towards the end of the 1960s, the plastic toys which Kellogg's products had were very intriguing to me when I was a 7-year-old. The Polish connection came rather later. And it was to do really not with my family, but with my stepfather's family. My stepfather had an Italian mother who, with her family, ran an ice cream shop in Dunfermline in Fife, and a Polish father who came from what is today Western Ukraine, a place called Krzemieniec, or Kremieniec, if we're thinking about the Russian or Ukrainian pronunciation. They met when my stepfather's father was a soldier stationed in Fife, got married, and then subsequently, after the Second World War, the stepfather's father, Nikita, or Nicky, stayed in Scotland. And when I was doing my undergraduate studies, I studied German and Russian initially at Cambridge University. I was intrigued by Russian, but I also thought, given that my stepfather's father still, my stepfather still had these contacts from his father's time in Poland, that for pragmatic reasons, I was much more likely to get to Poland than I was to the Soviet Union. Cambridge University had very bad relations with the Soviet Union for a variety of reasons, the behavior of the students particularly. So I made a kind of pragmatic decision that I'd give up German. I fell through various kinds of German, Baroque German. And then I thought, well, there's Polish, it's an opportunity. There'll be like 2 or 3 other people studying it at the time. Things have improved across the country in the meanwhile. And I thought, well, you know, at the end of it, I can get some money, go to Poland for a fortnight, meet all these people and speak the language, which wasn't in prospect really with Russian at that time. Mm-hmm. So it starts from the space race and ends up really with sort of family links. And once when I was completing my degree at Cambridge, which finally was in Russian, I was thinking about doing postdoctoral work or postgraduate work, certainly in Russian. But while I was abroad for a year, and this was doing Russian studies in Paris in the main, I met someone from Glasgow University, and I showed him this book, which the long-time lecturer in Polish studies at Glasgow University, Donald Pirrie, had given me at some point in Cambridge University. And he told me, well, this guy's at Glasgow. So I got in contact with him, invited him to come speak to the Slavonic Society in Cambridge. And this was in 1988. And at the end of 1988, there was a season called Polish Realities of contemporary Polish art and theatre and film and literature on in Glasgow. So I decided I would come to Glasgow and do postgraduate studies here. And I eventually, for want of something better, went on to do a doctorate in Glasgow University in Polish literature. Mm-hmm. So that's the long version.
Yeah. that is interesting how people end up where they are. Yeah. So could you briefly summarize it? I know you touched on there that parts of Poland were in Ukraine and things. Now the borders have actually changed, as far as I could see, quite often, and sometimes it's even disappeared in the history. So maybe from about 1800s onwards, could you sort of give us a brief summary?
1795 is the operative date normally. So the long 19th century, 1795 through to 1918, is the period in which largely Poland didn't exist. In some respects, it wasn't Poland that disappeared, divided between Prussia, Russia, and Austria in 1795. It was a much bigger entity, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which included parts of today's Ukraine and much of Belarus, and some parts of Western Russia as well, reaching almost down to the sort of Black Sea in the south. I'll sort of mention Donald Pirie again at this point, because someone posed this question, how can you define Poland? What is Poland? Because in the 19th century, it largely didn't exist. And he took it almost at a regional level, which is to say that there are a number of cities which have been always Polish. So the kind of heart of Poland is Poznan in the west, Warsaw in the north, and Krakow in the south or east. And that has always been the sort of core, really, of the Polish state. But the borders, as you say, Jenny, have changed massively in the intervening period. In the 19th century, the Poles fought on Napoleon's side. So they were involved in the invasion of Russia and the eventual catastrophe there. And in certain respects, the fact that they've participated in armed struggles throughout history has meant that they can't be brushed over. They are there, they are present, and can't be ignored. So the Polish problem really is one, we can say, that has existed since at least the end of the 18th century. Again, it was sort of reformulated after the Second World War. Something had to be done about the Poles. Were they going to be sort of absorbed into the Soviet Union or what? But after the Napoleonic campaigns, they set up under the Russian Tsar this kind of little state, the Congress Kingdom of Poland. And that was really modeled on a sort of Napoleon's sort of summer state, which Napoleon used as a kind of launch pad for the invasion of Russia in the more or less the decade from 1806 to 1814, 1815. So that was the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon didn't want to use Poland. It's funny, all of the partitioning powers in the 19th century avoid the term Poland. They don't want to acknowledge that, in fact, they partitioned a sovereign state back in 1795. And it's a kind of guilty conscience for both, these Central European powers, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, as well as for the West during the 19th century. In the 19th century, a bit like 18th century Scotland, you've got two major insurrections, one in 1830. Traditionally, Poles have used the months of the year, and this is reflective of the censorship that various partitioning powers have exerted over the Poles. So they would talk about the January insurrection for the later insurrection, which was 1863, and then the November insurrection for the November 1830 insurrection. And the Poles fought a sort of open campaign, which they were almost destined to lose against superior Russian forces in 1830. And as a result of that, you get a mass emigration of, between about 10,000 and 30,000 sort of intellectuals, poets, historians, writers, artists to the West, many of whom sort of congregate in Paris or in the suburbs of Paris. Some go to Belgium. Some of them make it as far as the Channel Islands, and indeed not continuously, but occasionally make it as far as Britain as well, to London, for instance. So if we're thinking, certainly, and this is, I know, sort of a later issue, but if we're thinking about Britain as a sort of a haven for Polish migrants, then it goes back at least, I would say, to the 1830s. And we've got reports in newspapers like the Times about how these poor migrants are being manipulated and cheated by very sort of sharp-witted natives, cheated out of their money. So there are certainly appeals to help this wave of migrants. The later insurrection in 1863 was more of a sort of guerrilla war, so it's not directly comparable with the Scottish insurrections of the 18th century, which were both open campaigns. And one of the things which the later insurrection made clear was that there was not unity in Polish society. It was largely a sort of a war conducted by students and intellectuals, and they'd expected the common populace, the peasantry, to support them, and they found they weren't. This is against the larger backdrop of the liberation of the peasants by the Russian Tsar Alexander II, 1861 in the Russian case, but they carried out they continued with these measures in the Polish areas around about the time of the insurrection, which was a very canny and cunning thing to do. And essentially, a number of the peasantry would turn over these Polish insurgents to the Russian forces, where they would be either executed or often, and this was a feature really of the Polish experience of Russia in the 19th century, sent into exile in the far east of Russia to Siberia.
Right.
It's really towards the end of the century that you get sort of differentiation amongst these partitioning powers. So Russia is very hard for Poles to endure. Both Russia and Prussian Germany insist upon the use of German and Russian as the language which should be used in public. So Polish, particularly in the Russian sector, becomes a kind of kitchen language. And throughout the 19th century, particularly the philosophers who wanted to be treated seriously are not writing in Polish, they're writing in German or possibly French. They have to go to university in places like Vienna, Berlin, or well, Kiev is the nearest sort of institution in the Slavonic lands, but obviously to St. Petersburg as well. And towards the end of the century, things ease up in Austro-Hungary, so that some of the things which we'll be talking about later, panoramas, are able to appear there, are able to be shown there. Whereas in the Russian sector, you've got an arbitrary rule, as you have today, I would suggest. Prussia is a state which is ruled by law, it's a Rechtsstaat, and there is recourse to the law when you're protesting as a Pole against instances of censorship, for example. There's none of that in Russia. But the most free place after 1867, when you've got the equalization of Hungary and Austria within the Habsburg realm, is the Austrian sector. And although the Poles don't have a country, there is a viceroy who's in charge of a large area which is today associated mostly with Ukraine, called Galicia. And in Galicia, the Poles have pretty much autonomy. So they're able to have a university in Lviv, which is a major cultural development. Also, there's one in Krakow, which has been there since the late 14th century. And that's really the sort of on the cusp of the First World War. You've got these three different states, and therefore Poles are fighting during the First World War in three different armies. They're fighting for the Germans, they're fighting for the Austrians against the Russians. It's a very confusing situation for them to be in. But the reality is that due to particularly American assistance and the American participation towards the end of the First World War, the Polish question rises again. Poland is recreated, but it's a much different state from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that had existed before 1795. And it's more sort of eastern, because you've got cities like Vilnius, which is in today's Lithuania, and Lviv, which is in today's Western Ukraine, as part of that country. With the Second World War, which is a fourth partition between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the borders shift about 120 miles to the west. So these towns, which look very Polish today, they get coach tours from Poland, like Lviv and Vilnius. Those are lost from the Polish perspective to their neighbours. But in return for that, the borders in the west move about 70 miles. So Poland acquires what are essentially German cities, Szczecin and Wrocław, Breslau, as part of the sort of settlement after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So then you have eventually a communist government in power for 45 years, which obviously in the first decade after the Second World War was a very repressive regime, and lots of people suffered, lots of people were killed by the secret police. But certainly after 1956, it competes with Hungary to be what someone termed the happiest barracks in the Soviet bloc. And that continues until we have obviously Solidarity in 1980, a mass workers' movement. And although the regime in a sort of final fling is able to clamp down and suppress the workers' movement, pressure from the Pope, who's Polish at that time, John Paul II, and also from Ronald Reagan, ensure that the Polish question sort of keeps alive. And it's really a question of how are they going to negotiate this transition from a communist state to a multi-party market-based democracy. And that's really the result of the so-called roundtable talks in I think February to April 1989, when you have this huge round table, which is symbolic of the fact that no one's on any sides. So all of the participants are engaged in the same endeavour to try and sort out what the future Poland will look like. And that's really the state that we have from 1989. We can talk about the various Polish governments, and it's not been quite as unstable as the Italian situation was sort of traditionally, but it's been a series of coalitions which the political system was engineered to provide.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that whole summary. And I'm just interested in all those boundary changes. Were there people that sort of clung on to believing they were Polish, or did they sort of accept, okay, we're in these, we're now in a different country? Or is Polish something that people clung on to?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I'm inclined to say, as a sort of literary scholar, basically, that it's through literature in the 19th century that Polish maintains a sense of national identity. For the Poles, looking at the German model, they think, well, if we can produce philosophers as great as, let's say, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kant, etc., that would really lead us to be taken seriously on the international stage. But although there's some very, very interesting developments in Polish thought in the 19th century, I think it's probably the literature which carries most of the burden. And I suspect you want to talk about one of the new canvases, which is on display in London by the painter Jan Matejko. And I think one tends to perhaps neglect slightly the impact of maybe the purely visual upon people's sense of identity in the 19th century. These panoramas that I briefly mentioned is a case in point, where in a sense, you see what your great history is. And Matejko particularly is a painter in the latter half of the 19th century who produces these enormous canvases. We've got, there are a number of them in the National Museum in Warsaw, including the very famous one of the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, which celebrates a coalition Polish-Lithuanian victory over the Teutonic Order, who are an international crusading order who run and ruled the Baltic littoral from pretty much Szczecin along to Riga. So they are the dominant force there.
Yeah, maybe Paul could share that. It was quite interesting in that blog post on the Polish at Heart blog about, is it the National Gallery in London that's just exhibiting the art, that's the first piece of Polish art, it said in that blog post. Is that correct? But so yeah, it's quite interesting, like as a sort of political artist. Yeah.
I mean, one of the problems with focusing upon the literature in a sense, and you've got sort of great romantic poets like Adam Mickiewicz, whose dates are 1796 through to 1855, is that what was a much more inclusive, albeit aristocratic, sort of polity before 1795 is then reduced to a kind of partly religious, ethnic, and certainly linguistic community during the course of the 19th century. So you define yourself as Polish if you speak Polish and are a Roman Catholic, really, which is a restrictive definition after the much more inclusive, certainly theoretically, it was a class-based system, definition of yourself as a citizen in Poland, Lithuania. But yeah, I think if it went for the literature, and then particularly in the Austrian sector, the theatre, which could be staged, where they could put these sort of grandiose, romantic or symbolic visions on stage, then there wouldn't be a sort of focus. But Polish was this sort of kitchen language, which was spoken away from the public area, which kind of has an impact on the mentality, because the Poles aren't allowed, as I said, to use the term Poland, particularly in the Russian sector in the 19th century. So as a kind of act of revenge, what they do is say, in our country, with us, u nas, literally. And that defines themselves as this kind of core against an outside world, which is fundamentally hostile.
Mm-hmm. So the common language actually allowed them to keep something going. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So, oh no, sorry, do you want to say some more?
No, the other thing I was going to say is it's a very interesting question, Jenny. What is Polish in the 19th century? One thing, Norman Davis makes this point in, I think, in God's Playground. If you asked local inhabitant out in the country somewhere, Western Ukraine, how do you define yourself? And this would apply up in the end to the end of the 19th century as well. They'd say, I'm from around here, jestem tutejszy. So it's kind of, so in a sense, you've got a sense of local sort of regional identity, but you might not have that overarching thing about, being Polish. I mean, maybe in those circumstances, being Polish is a bit like being British, and that's a sort of concept which has problems these days. That it allows you to come together in a larger sort of commonality. But this was the problem that the insurrectionists in 1863 faced. That they did not have a social and cultural common identity with the mass of the peasantry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll come back to social media questions maybe after the next thing. I was just going to ask you, could you outline some of the you said there was quite a few historical links between Scotland and Poland in sort of both directions. Could you just outline a few of the main ones there?
Yeah, we could go sort of west to east first. I think. It's not my work. There's a colleague at the University of the Highlands and Islands who has done a sort of project about Calvinist gravestones of Scottish people who emigrated and wound up in places near Gdańsk in the north of what is today's Poland. I think we're talking really about the sort of 17th and 18th centuries. And certainly prior to that, just thinking, actually, this is quite a naughty thought, but you've got these annual crusades that the Teutonic Order sort of organized, particularly against the Lithuanians, and you would get Scottish and English knights taking part in these crusades. So the Pope gave you a benediction so that you could fight your your crusade in Northern Europe rather than go out to the rather more difficult and rather more expensive area of the Middle East. But certainly Scots were appreciated for a number of things, generally sort of manufacturing, money. So in some respects, they were treated on the same level as sort of Jews and Armenians. They were seen as people who were sort of financially acute, and also as soldiers. And I think we do have records of under the second of the elected monarchs at the end of the 16th century, who was a Transylvanian prince called Báthory, Stefan Báthory. And he fought a very long campaign against the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV of Russia. And the Russians suffered eventually a great defeat outside what is today a Russian city called Pskov. It's also the subject for one of Mateko's canvases as well, the submission of the Russian emissaries to Báthory at Pskov in 1581. Scottish military expertise was particularly appreciated by these elected monarchs as well. Later on, and we were sort of talking briefly about this, there's the exceptional case, really, of Alexander Chalmers, who ended up as mayor of Warsaw. Sorry, I've noted these details down. Yes, he was from Dice. His dates are 1645 to 1703, and he ended up as mayor of Warsaw, which was really the sort of royal base by this time. It had moved from Krakow in the south to Warsaw in the north under the Swedish kings. And he was mayor on no less than 4 occasions from 1691 through to 1702. We've got a number of Scots who are also traveling through Poland, who end up serving the Russian monarchs, the Russian Tsars. And there's General Patrick Gordon of Ochluchris, who was a figure in the from the middle of the middle to the end of the 17th century, and his 5 volumes of his diaries have been published now. And the first volume of his diaries, which is 1635 to 1659, is his experience of traveling through Poland. And it's an extraordinary experience because he's in his 20s and he's traveling through a country which has been invaded by the Swedes, overrun by the Swedes, so-called deluge. And it's complete and utter chaos. So it's a very interesting read from that perspective. I think in more modern times, of course, you've got Michael Palin caught some of these people who ended up in contemporary Poland. So with the various consulting firms that took up residence in Warsaw and other Polish cities after I'd say the mid-90s, then there's a small but significant Scottish emigre community in places like Warsaw today. Mm-hmm. In terms of the other way, goodness, where does one start? I was suggesting that certainly an initial wave of migration could be seen as occurring, though how far it got is another question. In the after 1830, we do have, and we can read these in translation. Chopin's letter. Chopin travelled up to Edinburgh, was treated with great respect and honour by various Scottish aristocrats, and had a very positive impression of Scotland. But really the 2 major waves are after the Second World War, which is my stepfather's father's generation, and then the more recent wave, which I suppose we could say 2005, but in fact, although more people did come after 2005, there's a kind of interim migration. There was people who fled the country because of the fact that they feared repression under the communists with solidarity and being oppositionists. But there was a sort of I think basically Poles could work in Britain even prior to the 2005 treaty, and therefore 2005 helped to legalize, to normalize their position in society. And in a sense, we're deeply indebted to that generation, not just in Scotland, but in Britain as a whole, to keep our, well, it's ironic to think about it now, but to keep the hospitality industry going, because without them and people from other countries, including Hungary, it wouldn't be possible out in the wilds of Scotland to maintain these huge sort of Victorian hotels. Mm-hmm. The Second World War generation, and I mean, it's interesting. We've got the Sikorsky Club in Glasgow. Sikorsky died in an airplane accident off Gibraltar in April 1943, and he was really the sort of person who helped to unite, because of his originally military but subsequent political authority, the factions within the Polish government. And in a sense, it was a great tragedy that he died, because after the war, it fell upon the leader of the so-called Peasant Party, People's Party, to try and find a place in post-war Poland, and he was completely deceived by the Russians and their Polish communist allies, a man called Stanisław Mikołajczyk. Churchill sent him off to Poland, expecting him to take part in this multi-party democracy. And then when he managed to escape, I think in late 1946, he said, well, that was a lucky escape, essentially. So in some respects, people like Churchill, Roosevelt were not under any illusions about, Stalin's manipulation of power and the control that he was going to seek to fasten. But what happened was that essentially, there were two sort of Polish armies during the Second World War, one fighting on the Eastern Front with the Russians, who helped to liberate Poland, and then a force of, I think, some 100,000 men who had found themselves in Russia because of that partition between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. And they were transported to the Far East, to Siberia. Some ended up in camps, some ended up in Central Asia, for instance. And the repatriation of that generation took decades. So you've got a repatriation immediately after the Second World War to communist-occupied Poland. And then after 1956, again, you've got hundreds of thousands more coming, because they were really scattered across the old Soviet Union. And this generation, the troops who were asked after June 1941, when the Nazis attacked Soviet Russia, to help form an army. And they did form an army in the Soviet Union under General Anders. And General Anders was asking where all his commissioned officers were. And these were people, 11,000 more or less in total, who had been taken by the Soviet secret police and executed in woods around Smolensk in this period from September, after the partition, from September 1939 to sometime in 1940. So this was a tremendous embarrassment for the Russians, because they were now really asking for Polish help against the Soviet invasion. So when he didn't get an answer from Stalin about what had happened to those officers, he decided that he would take the army out of Russia through Persia and eventually across the Mediterranean via Gibraltar back to Britain. Mm-hmm. And they formed a Western army, a fair number of whom became paratroopers, and they're famous for their action in Arnhem, celebrated in the film The Bridge Too Far. The army, my stepfather's father was a regular sort of army soldier. His friend, who went back to Poland after the Second World War, was a paratrooper. So the army obviously fought in the sort of continental campaign, but was also involved in from the Polish perspective, I think, a famous struggle to control the monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy. And the Soviet force, the Polish forces were there en masse, and that was sort of commemorated. So in some respects, when you consider the sort of military traditions in Poland, the more contemporary ones, you've got the Western forces with their sort of battle and victory at Monte Cassino, and then you've got the Eastern Front, who were helping the Soviets, but equally sort of genuinely wanted to liberate the country.
Okay.
So that's the generation that I kind of grew up with in Scotland, and formed the basis for really set up these Polish clubs. There was the political differences. I mentioned Sikorski, Piłsudski, who was the great interwar leader, staged a coup in May 1926. At the time when Sikorski was heading a quite right-wing government in the newly independent Poland. So that led to everlasting enmity between them. And in some respects, that finds reflection in the way that the Polish clubs are set up. You don't see too many Piłsudski Polish clubs these days. So Sikorski survived in Glasgow, but there was a Piłsudski club overlooking the M8. Where it goes right through the city centre. And certainly in Falkirk, there were two Polish clubs, and kind of never the twain shall meet, essentially. This kind of hostility because of the different political outlooks. Piłsudski having the old sort of cosmopolitan, inclusive vision. But that's, I don't know enough about Sikorski's politics, but certainly it was interesting that he was prime minister of a fairly right-wing government that Piłsudski felt he had to stage a coup against in 1926.
Okay, brilliant. Right, is there any questions coming, Paul, from the social media site?
We don't have any questions yet, but I wanted to ask one because you mentioned Poland's contribution during the Second World War, and I was reminded of this story, or how true this is, I don't know, about Poland being essentially excluded from the kind of post-war celebrations. And what is the story of that, and why did that happen?
On the basis of my stepfather's father's experience, the Polish troops who fought so courageously during the Second World War on the Western Front were really sort of excluded. They were not naturalized until about a decade after the Second World War had ended. They didn't get passports. And in part, I think, over time, it may have just been forgetting. So I was interested when I looked at that site, and it kind of suddenly Tony Blair realizes, around about 2005, that the Poles should be involved in these victory celebrations. And think, well, you really don't know very much about Polish history, do you? And then there was the whole issue over Smolensk, over the sort of Cat and Woods murders, which, the Churchill knew who was responsible. The Russian government persistently denied it had happened. The Polish government in exile, I think, which regarded itself as the only legitimate government because it was, fully free, continued with that questioning of the Soviet involvement. So I think, and it's not an exclusively Polish thing. Those Poles who'd fought on the Western Front were just an embarrassment for the British government, and I think. I'm surmising that it's really because, they didn't want to antagonize Stalin, certainly initially in the immediate post-war period, and that sort of flagging up the Polish contribution on the Western Front might have been at least part of the reason for not including the danger of that, for not including any acknowledgement of the Polish part. But I mean, I'm just trying to think, in popular culture, you've got the major contribution by the Polish airmen during the Battle of Britain, which I don't think has been disguised. I mean, the Czechs as well, for that matter. But it's kind of this sort of, well, at least dual approach where you've got some acknowledgement, there's commemoration, but it's not that major commemoration. And I don't think these days, for instance, that when you've got Putin celebrating the end of the Second World War, that you'd necessarily have any Polish representation there. But of course, the Poles played a significant part in that armed conflict as well. But I'm just surmising, Paul. I mean, I know from my work in the censorship archives that there was a possibility, certainly in the late 1970s, where the Polish government, the communists at the time, could acknowledge that the Soviets were responsible for the murder of 11,000 Polish officers in Cat and Woods. And they decided to suppress it because they didn't think it would be helpful.
Mm.
Wow. Okay, thanks. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And the Polish pilots, did I hear that they were sent back to Poland, and actually that was quite dangerous for them?
Yes, I mean that would have been. I'm not sure. I don't have enough information. There is the monograph by Adam Zamoyski. They're called the Few, the pilots as a whole, obviously. But he does sort of focus on the fate of the Polish pilots. I mean, some people, and I mean, my stepfather's friend decided to go back after the Second World War. Although I talked to him, I met him during my first trip to Poland. I didn't think to ask, what he'd faced in the decade after the Second World War ended, because often they were persecuted, they were tortured, and in a sense, they were kind of suppressed fact throughout the whole of post-war communist Poland. And it's really only after 1989 that you can get sort of acknowledgement and public celebration, commemoration of their deeds in Poland itself.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking we're slightly running out of time, but there's two really, just if you could just quickly tell us a bit about the Panorama, because I thought that with the sort of multimedia age nowadays, I thought that's quite an unusual thing, really quite early on. Is it in Raklawice?
Racławice, yes. Racławice, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And perhaps a little brief bit about the television portrayal of Polish people, which you've studied as well. Just a little bit on both of those would be brilliant.
Yeah, sorry, I say it's in Wrocław, so it's in a big sort of circular building, which was built specifically for it. Normally these things were just sort of, there were paintings, there were sort of 360-degree paintings which people could go into, and there were loads of them. I mean, we have the phenomenon in Scotland with the sort of 360-degree perspective you can get if you go up a tower in Edinburgh.
Oh,
and it's that kind of idea. So basically, I think probably from the late 18th century onwards, but certainly during the 19th century, and these things toured, and they toured Britain as well. So that post first insurrection generation were able to promote their cause really through these very visual things. The building has meant that a bit more has been done to it. So obviously they had to restore this thing, which is the only sort of extant one as far as we know. And we suspect it was done in the Austrian sector, since it was commemorating a battle in 1794. It was likely to be celebrating the centenary, 1894, and they would have been able to show it in that sector because it was showing a conflict against the Russians, who were rivals in Central Europe. But they managed to make a three-dimensional thing out of it. So you've got, disappearing into the distance effect, and they've got figures, and you're on a platform and you look around it. You can do a 360-degree sort of tour, but it's amazing. And the visual and the sort of mental impact of that on the morale boosting sort of aspects of it must have been tremendous during the 19th century. Sorry, the second.
Oh, the other thing was just I see you'd studied just the portrayal of sort of Polish characters in, was it on UK TV?
Yes,
just a wee tiny bit about that, but
well, there was a Polish TV series, two series of it called Londoners, Londynczycy, and obviously it's based in London, but it was quite interesting because what they were kind of selling was one of the slogans associated with the series was "From Hero to Zero." I can't remember how they ended that in od zera do bohatera or something. It was very London based, but it was showing how the Poles can, as one of the sort of 70s slogans has it, Polak potrafi, how they could manage to migrate to the country and make a success of things. There was an episode of Taggart called Homesick, which was devoted, it sort of invoked the Polish experience in Glasgow. So it's, as we know, it's set in Glasgow, and it was a couple of murders, and it turns out that this Scottish man is insanely jealous of his younger Polish wife and can't abide the fact that she's seen a guy who happens to be gay, and totally misunderstands the situation. But it's set in and around Kelvin Grove Park, so you've got some views there. The Polish Taster shop, which initially was on the far side of the, well, I think it is still on the far side of the university, going out towards Anniesland, features as well. So what intrigued me is what Scottish scriptwriters thought would constitute the Polish experience. They did some filming in the Sikorski Club, which interestingly they called the Kaczynski Club, which I think that was really sort of maybe going a step too far. Maybe they weren't happy with them calling it the Sikorski, but it was the Sikorski. In some respects, obviously the focus is on the sort of major figures in the series. But what's quite interesting is that what is Polishness, and it's the Second World War. Obviously, the new generation are this generation of repressed, exploited workers, and there's obviously some truth in that. But one thing I will say is that, in some respects, it downplays Polish agency and Polish activism, because I'm part of a group called the Cross-Party Group for Poland in the Scottish Parliament, which meets, well, it's not met for a few months now, but it supposedly meets every 3 months. And it's the community of Poles in Scotland. And we talk about issues to do with mental health, to do with education. We've been trying to get Polish qualifications in schools, and that's starting to have some effect now. But Poles were, I think, the original organisers of the sort of sit-in strikes, and this was something that they developed at the end of the 19th century in the Russian sector. Basically, they realised that the authorities would bring in scabs, would bring in black-leg workers to run the machinery in their absence. So what they would do is take over the factories, and that kind of tradition, really, of sort of working-class activism tends to get elided, I think, tends to get missed in when we're thinking about the Poles, because they're not just victims. They have, to a large extent, shaped their fate, I would say. So in a sense, the Taggart program rather misrepresents that. But it's I was just interested in seeing what they say. And I mean, one of the problems certainly that comes out in the Londoners series is masculinity is an issue. In some respects, women are better positioned, Polish women, better positioned to make the transition from the home country to start a successful life in Britain. And I think to an extent that's also true of the way that the Poles were portrayed in Taggart. The central Polish character is actually not a Polish person. You can tell by the way she pronounces Polish words if you listen along. But it was interesting. I was glad. There was a Russian episode of Taggart, which they well, from our perspective in Slavonic, took over our building for the Hetherington building for one weekend and left us with a load of wine. So they don't pay you any money, but they do leave you booze, the Taggart crew. But it was in some respects even more sort of tangential to the sort of Russian situation. There wasn't really a Russian community at the time to the same extent that there is today in Scotland.
Yeah. Well, it's been very interesting. A whirlwind tour through history. And was there anything crucial came through, Paul, on social media? Because we've probably run out of time. Or is that?
Oh, sorry.
No. Okay, so we've covered loads of stuff there, and it's been really interesting. And on Taggart as well, so used to be my favourite. So thanks very much, John, for joining us this evening, and I hope everyone's found that really interesting to listen to. I'm sure they will have. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure. So anytime in the future, but yes, good luck with the rest of your meetings as and when they occur.